Imagine discovering ruins so magnificent, so architecturally sophisticated, that they rival the great achievements of medieval Europe. Stone walls reaching 36 feet high, constructed without mortar through engineering principles that would challenge modern builders. A city that once housed up to 20,000 people, controlling trade routes that stretched from southern Africa to China and Persia. Now imagine that when European colonizers encountered these ruins in the late 19th century, their first instinct wasn't wonder or scholarly curiosity, but denial. Not just skepticism, but an active, aggressive refusal to believe that black Africans could have built such a civilization. For nearly a century, the story of Great Zimbabwe became a battleground, not just over history, but over the very question of African humanity and capability. What's good, folks? Before we dive into this, I want to acknowledge something up front. We're going to be talking about a site that touches on some deeply painful aspects of colonial history, the way racism shaped archaeology and historical interpretation, and how the legacies of those distortions continue to affect us today. I'm coming at this as someone who's spent considerable time researching this topic, but I'm also aware that there are scholars who've dedicated their entire careers to understanding Great Zimbabwe. And there are communities for whom this site holds sacred significance that goes beyond what any outsider can fully grasp. What I'm offering here is an exploration of how colonial racism literally tried to erase one of Africa's greatest civilizations from history, and how the truth eventually prevailed despite decades of intentional suppression. So let's talk about Great Zimbabwe, the ruins that Europeans refused to believe existed as an African achievement, and what that refusal tells us about the foundations of white supremacy and the ongoing work of decolonizing our understanding of African history. Here's what we need to understand from the beginning. Great Zimbabwe wasn't some minor settlement or isolated village. Between roughly 1100 and 1450 CE, it functioned as the capital of a major kingdom that controlled more than 100,000 square kilometers of territory in what is now Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Botswana, and South Africa. The site itself covers nearly 1,800 acres, making it the largest ancient stone structure south of the Sahara. The most impressive feature, known as the Great Enclosure, has outer walls that extend 820 feet in circumference and reach heights of up to 36 feet. These walls were constructed from granite blocks, fitted together without any mortar, using a technique that required incredible precision and understanding of load distribution and structural engineering. The city was divided into three main architectural zones. The hill complex, sometimes called the Acropolis, sits on a steep hill rising 262 feet above the surrounding landscape. Archaeological evidence shows this was the oldest part of the site, with construction beginning around the year 900 CE. It's believed to have served as the spiritual and religious center of the kingdom. The Great Enclosure, the most iconic structure, likely housed royal residences and served ceremonial purposes. Inside its massive outer walls stands a conical tower, 33 feet high, whose exact function remains debated by scholars. Some suggest it was a symbolic grain storage facility, representing the kingdom's wealth and the ruler's role as provider. Others propose religious or astronomical significance. The valley ruins contained the residential areas where craftspeople, traders, and the general population lived and worked. At its height in the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe was home to between 10,000 and 20,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's comparable to many significant European cities of the same period. The economy was sophisticated and diverse. Archaeological evidence shows extensive cattle herding, with cattle serving not just as food, but as a primary form of wealth and social currency. Residents cultivated crops including sorghum, pearl millet, and finger millet. But what really set Great Zimbabwe apart was its role as a hub in the Indian Ocean trade network. Excavations have uncovered Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, Arab coins from Kilwa, glass beads from Southeast Asia, and evidence of copper from the Zambezi River region. The kingdom controlled gold mining throughout the surrounding territory. Some estimates suggest that for 3 centuries, approximately 40% of the world's gold came from this region, with over 4,000 gold mines identified in the area surrounding Great Zimbabwe. This wasn't a primitive society. It was a complex, stratified civilization with specialized craftspeople, including goldsmiths, blacksmiths, potters, weavers, and stonemasons. The city had sophisticated water management systems that remain functional to this day. The precision of the stonework rivals ancient architectural wonders anywhere in the world. The famous soapstone bird sculptures found at the site, which now appear on Zimbabwe's national flag, demonstrate advanced artistic traditions and likely served religious and political functions, perhaps as royal totems representing the power of Shona kings? So that's what Great Zimbabwe actually was. Now let's talk about what happened when Europeans encountered it, because this is where the story gets both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Portuguese explorers probably first encountered the ruins in the 16th century. Early Portuguese writings refer to a place called Zimbabwe, but these accounts were limited and didn't generate widespread European interest. The ruins remained relatively unknown to the wider world until 1871, when a German geologist named Karl Moch arrived at the site. What Moch saw should have generated excitement about African achievement and civilization. Instead, it generated something else entirely. Immediate assumption that Africans couldn't possibly have built such structures. Moch's response is instructive because it reveals the foundational racism that would shape European interpretation of the site for the next century. He looked at these magnificent stone walls and declared they must be the legendary city of Ophir, the source of King Solomon's mines mentioned in the Bible. The idea that the local Shona people, whose ancestors had actually built these structures, could have created such a civilization was, to Moch and his contemporaries, literally unthinkable. This wasn't just casual prejudice. It was a systematic worldview that positioned Black Africans as fundamentally incapable of advanced civilization, a worldview that needed to be maintained to justify the ongoing colonization of Africa and the enslavement of African people. Over the following decades, as more European explorers and amateur archaeologists visited the site, the theories became increasingly elaborate and increasingly absurd. Great Zimbabwe was attributed to Phoenicians, ancient Egyptians, Arabs, Greeks, and even, in some accounts, shipwrecked Vikings or the mythological inhabitants of Atlantis. Every theory had one thing in common. The builders had to be anyone except the indigenous African people who actually lived there and whose oral histories explicitly connected them to the ruins. In 1891, Theodore Bent, leading an expedition funded by the Royal Geographical Society and the British Association for the Advancement of Science, examined the site. He found soapstone bird carvings that he felt resembled artifacts from Near Eastern and Mediterranean civilizations he had studied. This superficial similarity was enough for him to conclude that Great Zimbabwe was built by some ancient non-African civilization. When you step back and look at this with clear eyes, the intellectual dishonesty is staggering. Here's an archaeologist who's supposed to be conducting scientific inquiry, and he's essentially working backwards from his conclusion. He needed the ruins to be non-African, so he found the flimsiest excuse to declare them non-African. It's important to understand why this mattered so much to the British colonial project. By 1891, the ruins were part of territory administered by Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company. This land would become Southern Rhodesia, literally named after Rhodes, one of the most aggressive proponents of British imperialism and white supremacy in Africa. Rhodes was a true believer in what was called the white man's burden, the racist ideology that positioned Europeans as having a civilizing mission to uplift the supposedly inferior peoples of the world. For Rhodes and the white settlers flooding into the region, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe presented a problem. If Africans had built sophisticated civilizations before European arrival, it undermined the entire justification for colonization. The colonial project relied on the narrative that Africa was a savage, uncivilized wilderness that needed European guidance. Evidence of African achievement before colonization threatened that narrative, so the narrative had to be controlled, and if evidence didn't support the desired narrative, well, then the evidence would be destroyed. Enter Richard Hall, the man who did more damage to Great Zimbabwe than perhaps any other single individual. In 1902, Rhodes hired Hall, a journalist and amateur archaeologist, to examine and preserve the site. Hall published a book titled The Ancient Ruins of Rhodesia, in which he asserted that Great Zimbabwe had been constructed by more civilized races. But Hall didn't stop at writing racist theories. He embarked on what he called restoration work that systematically destroyed the archaeological record. Hall spent months removing sediment and debris from the site, in some areas digging up to 2 meters deep throughout the ruins. His stated goal was to remove what he called the filth and decadence of African occupation. Think about what that means. He was literally trying to erase the evidence of African habitation at the site. In the process, he destroyed stratigraphic layers that could have provided conclusive proof of the ruins' origins and development over time. He discarded or failed to properly catalog countless artifacts. Professional archaeologists describe Hall's work as catastrophic to our understanding of the site, because he essentially destroyed the archaeological context that would have allowed for proper scientific analysis. This wasn't accidental. This was ideological vandalism dressed up as preservation. Hall was trying to scrub away the evidence of African achievement so he could maintain his racist fantasy of ancient white or Near Eastern builders. The tragedy is that he succeeded in destroying information that we'll never be able to recover. We'll never know what those layers of sediment could have told us about the daily lives of Great Zimbabwe's residents, about the evolution of the city over centuries, about the material culture that Hall threw away because it didn't fit his narrative. But here's what Hall and the other colonial propagandists couldn't destroy: the evidence that remained and the integrity of the professional archaeologists who eventually examined it. The turning point came in 1905, when David Randall McIver, a British archaeologist and the first professionally trained archaeologist to study the site, conducted a systematic excavation. Randall McIver approached the ruins with actual scientific methodology. He didn't select only the evidence that fit a predetermined conclusion. He cataloged everything he found, analyzed the pottery styles, examined the construction techniques, and compared what he found to other known African archaeological sites. His conclusion was clear and unambiguous. Great Zimbabwe was medieval in age and of African origin. The pottery, the artifacts, the construction methods all pointed to the local Shona people as the builders. Randall McIver published his findings in a 1906 book titled Medieval Rhodesia. The reception from the colonial establishment was immediate and hostile. His work caused what historians describe as a furious academic controversy. White Rhodesians and many European academics rejected his findings outright, not because of any flaw in his methodology, not because he had misinterpreted the evidence, but simply because they could not accept the implications. To accept that Africans had built Great Zimbabwe meant accepting that African civilizations had achieved architectural and social complexity comparable to European civilizations. It meant acknowledging African humanity and capability in a way that fundamentally challenged the racist foundations of colonialism. So Randall McIver's work was dismissed, questioned, attacked. The colonial narrative continued to dominate, not in academic journals, where his research was increasingly recognized as sound, but in the popular imagination and in the official positions of the Rhodesian government. The truth had been documented, but institutional racism fought hard to suppress it. The confirmation came in 1929, when Gertrude Caton Thompson, a British archaeologist, was invited by the British Association for the Advancement of Science to conduct another examination of Great Zimbabwe. This is where the story gets really interesting, because Caton Thompson brought an all-female team to the excavation. Her team included architect Dorothy Noir, who created detailed architectural reconstructions of the site, and a young Kathleen Kenyon, fresh out of university and on her first archaeological dig. Kenyon would go on to become one of the most important archaeologists of the 20th century, pioneering new excavation techniques. Caton Thompson approached the site with meticulous scientific rigor. She developed and applied sequence dating methods that allowed her to establish a clear chronology of occupation and construction at different parts of the site. She controlled strictly for stratigraphy, ensuring that artifacts were understood in their proper context. Her findings confirmed everything Randall McIver had concluded nearly 25 years earlier. In her report, she was explicit. Examination of all the existing evidence, gathered from every quarter, still can produce not one single item that is not in accordance with the claim of Bantu origin and medieval date. When Caton Thompson presented her findings at the British Association for the Advancement of Science's annual meeting in Johannesburg in 1929, it caused an uproar. The timing couldn't have been more charged. The meeting came right after the election of General Hertzog in South Africa, whose government was committed to expanding racial segregation and followed race riots in Durban. The anthropologist Raymond Dart, known for his discovery of the Taung child fossil, reportedly threw what witnesses described as a hissy fit in response to Caton Thompson's presentation. The idea that a woman had definitively proven African achievement in that time and place was too much for many in the audience to handle. But Caton Thompson's work was too rigorous to dismiss. She had used the most advanced archaeological methods of her time. She had documented everything meticulously. She had physical evidence, stratigraphic analysis, comparative data. Within the academic archaeological community, the question was settled. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. It dated to the medieval period, and it represented a sophisticated African civilization that had thrived for centuries before European contact. You might think that would be the end of the story, that scientific evidence had triumphed over racist ideology. But you'd be wrong. The Rhodesian government, dominated by white settlers committed to maintaining racial hierarchy, simply refused to accept the academic consensus. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, under the government of Ian Smith, who had declared Rhodesia's independence from Britain in 1965, specifically to avoid implementing majority rule, official position remained that Great Zimbabwe could not have been built by black Africans. Tourist materials depicted black Africans bowing submissively to white visionaries who had supposedly built the stone walls and grand structures. School curricula taught white Rhodesian children that the ruins were the work of ancient non-African civilizations. Archaeologists who contradicted the government's position were censored, their work suppressed, their careers threatened. This wasn't just historical revisionism. This was active, state-sponsored suppression of scientific truth in service of white supremacy. The Rhodesian government understood that accepting the truth about Great Zimbabwe meant accepting the legitimacy of African civilization, which in turn undermined their justification for white minority rule. If Africans had built Great Zimbabwe, if they had established sophisticated kingdoms and trade networks, and artistic traditions centuries before European arrival, then the whole civilizing mission narrative collapsed. The foundation of colonial rule was the idea that Africans needed Europeans, that Africans were incapable of self-governance, that African history was one of savagery and primitivism. Great Zimbabwe proved all of that was a lie. So let's talk about what made Great Zimbabwe so impressive, because I think it's important to understand the scale of achievement that colonialism tried to erase. The architectural sophistication alone is remarkable. The granite blocks used in construction were quarried from the surrounding hills, where the rock naturally splits into even slabs. But getting these slabs to fit together precisely, without mortar, in walls that would stand for centuries, required extraordinary skill and engineering knowledge. The builders had to understand load distribution, how to create inward slopes that would stabilize the walls, how to create courses that would hold together under their own weight. Some sections of the great enclosure walls are over 16 feet thick at the base, tapering as they rise. The top of the walls features decorative patterns, including chevron designs, demonstrating that this wasn't purely functional architecture, but also aesthetic expression. The famous conical tower inside the great enclosure is a solid structure, meaning it wasn't built around a hollow center. It's approximately 33 feet tall and 18 feet in diameter. Building a freestanding stone tower to that height, without mortar, without internal support, is an engineering feat. Contemporary scholars still debate exactly how it was constructed and what techniques were used to achieve the stability it has maintained for over 500 years. The hill complex shows even more sophisticated architectural planning. Built on a steep hillside, it required careful terracing and integration with the natural rock formations. The builders incorporated natural boulders into the walls, using the existing landscape rather than fighting against it. This demonstrates an understanding of the environment and an architectural philosophy that worked with natural features. Narrow passages wind between massive granite boulders, leading to enclosed spaces that must have served specific ceremonial or administrative functions. The soapstone bird sculptures represent another dimension of Great Zimbabwe's sophistication. 8 of these birds have been recovered from the site, each carved from a single piece of soapstone, mounted on columns, with detailed attention to the musculature and features of birds of prey. These weren't crude carvings. They were refined artistic works that required skilled craftsmanship and likely held deep religious and political significance. The birds probably represented royal authority, the connection between earthly rulers and spiritual powers, the protective force of kingship over the people. The economic complexity of Great Zimbabwe was equally impressive. The kingdom didn't just participate in the Indian Ocean trade network, it was a major player. Gold from the Zimbabwe Plateau made its way to Kilwa on the East African coast, where it entered trade routes that stretched to Arabia, India, and China. In exchange, luxury goods flowed back: Chinese Celadon pottery, Persian glass vessels, Indian beads, textiles, and other high-value items. This wasn't passive participation in trade. Great Zimbabwe's rulers actively controlled the gold mining in their territory, regulated trade routes, negotiated with coastal merchants, managed the collection and processing of ivory from the hunting of elephants. Archaeological evidence shows gold smelting and working happened throughout the site, with crucibles and finished gold objects found in multiple locations, indicating many hands were involved in gold production. The agricultural base that supported all of this was substantial. With a population of potentially 20,000 at the city's peak, feeding everyone required organized agriculture, crop storage, distribution systems. Cattle weren't just wealth, they were draft animals for cultivation. They provided milk and meat, and they held social and religious significance. The presence of specialized craft workers, blacksmiths who worked iron and copper, potters who created both utilitarian and decorative vessels, weavers who produced cloth, indicates a society with significant economic stratification and specialization. This wasn't everyone doing a little bit of everything. This was a society where people could dedicate themselves to mastering specific crafts because the agricultural surplus was sufficient to support non-agricultural specialists. All of this, and I want to emphasize this, all of this existed and flourished before the first European ever set foot in the region. This was African achievement, African ingenuity, African civilization, operating at a level that rivaled or exceeded contemporary societies in other parts of the world during the same period. And yet, for nearly a century, the dominant narrative in European and European-descended societies was that Africans couldn't have done this. That level of denial, that commitment to racist ideology, even in the face of overwhelming physical evidence, tells us something important about how white supremacy operates. The story of Great Zimbabwe isn't just about one archaeological site. It's about the systematic erasure of African history and achievement, and it's about how that erasure served specific political and economic interests. When we understand that colonizers actively destroyed evidence, suppressed scientific findings, censored academics, and maintained false narratives through state power, we start to see how much work went into creating and maintaining the fiction of African inferiority. This connects directly to present-day struggles over historical narrative and memory. Fight over how to tell the story of Great Zimbabwe is fundamentally the same fight we see over how to teach slavery, colonialism, and racism in schools today. It's the same fight over whose history gets centered, whose achievements get celebrated, whose experiences get validated. When people push back against teaching the full truth of colonial history, when they argue that examining racism is divisive or makes white people feel bad, they're using the same playbook that the Rhodesian government used when it censored archaeologists and suppressed evidence about Great Zimbabwe. The truth is that knowledge about the past is never neutral. It's always connected to power in the present. The Rhodesian government understood this perfectly. They knew that if Black Rhodesians understood that their ancestors had built Great Zimbabwe, had created sophisticated civilizations, had participated in global trade networks, it would give them a sense of historical agency and pride that would make them harder to oppress and control. So the truth had to be suppressed, not because it was scientifically questionable, but precisely because it was scientifically solid and politically dangerous. There's a bitter irony in the fact that Great Zimbabwe's abandonment around 1450 CE likely resulted from environmental pressures and resource depletion, problems that affected many medieval cities worldwide. But European colonizers interpreted the ruins as evidence of decline and primitivism rather than as evidence of a civilization that had risen, flourished, and eventually relocated as conditions changed. They couldn't conceive of African societies as dynamic entities that grew, adapted, and transformed over time like all human societies. They needed Africans to be forever primitive, forever in need of European guidance. When Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980, after years of armed struggle against white minority rule, one of the first things the new government did was adopt the name Zimbabwe, connecting the new nation explicitly to the historical kingdom and the ruins that represented African achievement. The soapstone bird from Great Zimbabwe became a central feature of the national flag. This wasn't just symbolism, it was a deliberate reclaiming of history, a statement that African history didn't begin with colonization, that the land had a long, rich history before Europeans arrived, and that the people fighting for their freedom were standing on the shoulders of ancestors who had built something magnificent. In 1986, a year after Gertrude Caton Thompson's death, Great Zimbabwe was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The recognition came not just for the architectural and archaeological significance, but also for the site's role in the history and identity of the Zimbabwean people. Today, the ruins remain a sacred site for many Zimbabweans, particularly those from the Shona clans whose ancestors built and inhabited the city. Local communities maintain spiritual connections to Great Zimbabwe, seeing it not as dead ruins, but as a living link to their past and to their ancestors. The physical damage that Richard Hall and other early colonial excavators caused can never be undone. The stratigraphic layers they destroyed are gone forever. The artifacts they discarded or failed to catalog are lost. We'll never have a complete picture of Great Zimbabwe's development because too much evidence was deliberately destroyed. That's a permanent scar on our collective human knowledge, a reminder of what we lose when ideology triumphs over truth. But what couldn't be destroyed was the fundamental evidence that remained, the ruins themselves, the artifacts that survived Hall's destruction, and the truth that professional archaeologists eventually documented despite enormous political pressure to maintain the lies. Randall McIver and Caton Thompson and the other researchers who insisted on scientific integrity, even when it meant challenging the colonial establishment, helped ensure that the truth about Great Zimbabwe would eventually be known. All in all, the story of Great Zimbabwe teaches us several crucial lessons. First, it reminds us that Africa had complex, sophisticated civilizations long before European contact, civilizations that participated in global trade, that built monumental architecture, that developed artistic traditions, that organized politically and economically at high levels of complexity. The narrative of Africa as a primitive continent without history is a lie created to justify exploitation. Second, it shows us that the suppression of truth requires constant work and institutional power. The Rhodesian government had to actively censor archaeologists, control tourist materials, manipulate school curricula, and punish dissent to maintain their false narrative about Great Zimbabwe. The truth was always there, supported by evidence, but it took political will and state power to keep that truth from being widely accepted. Third, it demonstrates that historical narratives are never just about the past. They're always about the present and the future. The fight over Great Zimbabwe's origins was really a fight over political legitimacy, over who had the right to govern, over whether racial hierarchy could be justified. When we see similar fights over historical narrative today, we should recognize that those fights are also about power and legitimacy in the present. Fourth, it reminds us that scientific integrity matters, that evidence matters, that truth matters, even when truth is politically inconvenient or challenges our assumptions. Randall McIver and Caton Thompson could have taken the easy path, could have produced findings that would have been welcomed by the colonial establishment and their own societies. Instead, they followed the evidence where it led and documented what they found, even knowing it would be controversial. And finally, the story of Great Zimbabwe shows us that truth, while it can be suppressed for a time, eventually emerges. It took decades. It required courage from academics who were willing to challenge institutional power. It wasn't easy, but the truth about Great Zimbabwe's African origins eventually became accepted scholarly consensus and is now common knowledge. That's both encouraging and sobering, because while truth eventually prevailed, the decades of denial caused real harm, distorted the self-understanding of generations of people, and destroyed irreplaceable historical evidence. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe stand today as a testament to African achievement and to the resilience of truth. They're also a warning about what we risk losing when we allow ideology to triumph over evidence, when we permit the powerful to control narratives for their own benefit, when we fail to challenge lies because the truth is uncomfortable. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. How do we balance honoring the historical achievements represented by sites like Great Zimbabwe while also acknowledging the ongoing impacts of the colonial distortions and denials that surrounded them? How do we teach this history in ways that empower people without creating new forms of mythologization? And what other examples can you think of where colonial powers systematically denied or erased evidence of African or indigenous achievement? Let's continue this conversation in the comments, because these questions matter not just for understanding the past, but for how we move forward in the present. As always, I appreciate you all for watching and for engaging with this content. The work of recovering and sharing these histories is ongoing, and it's a collective project. We're all learning together, all working to understand our shared human history more completely and more honestly. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.